The radio crackle cut through the operations center like a blade through silk, and every head in the room turned toward the same frequency. The voice on the other end was controlled, professional, measured in the way that only comes from years of training overriding pure instinct. But underneath that control, anyone who'd spent time in the field could hear it, the edge of someone calculating their final moves. The Navy SEAL team pinned down in the Helmand Valley wasn't screaming, wasn't panicking, wasn't begging. They were simply stating facts. 3 kilometers from extraction, 12 insurgents with heavy weapons in elevated positions, 2 wounded, ammunition critical. The kind of situation where minutes don't matter because seconds are already running out. The combat air controller repeated the coordinates twice, his voice flat, almost bureaucratic, like he was ordering supplies rather than calling in what might be the last air support his team would ever see. In the briefing room at Bagram, the air boss stood with his arms crossed, staring at the tactical display like it might spontaneously offer solutions. The closest Apache was 20 minutes out, fuel already borderline for the return trip. The F-16s were committed to a strike package 2 provinces over. The Predator had a missile left but no angle through the terrain. Someone muttered something about acceptable losses, and the room went colder than the Hindu Kush in January. Then a voice came through on the secondary channel, calm and unhurried, with an accent that carried the plains of Nebraska beneath its syllables. Bagram Actual, this is Reaper 2-1. I've got eyes on your situation. 4 minutes out. The air boss glanced at his watch, then at the roster board, his expression shifting from relief to something more complicated. The call sign Reaper 2-1 belonged to an A-10 Thunderbolt that had been running a routine patrol pattern along the Pakistani border, low and slow, the kind of mission that rarely made it into after-action reports. The pilot was Captain Marin Voss, 34 years old, 11 years in service, 3 deployments, and a reputation that depended entirely on who you asked. To the maintainers who kept her aircraft flying, she was meticulous and grateful, the kind of pilot who remembered names and brought coffee on cold mornings. To the intelligence officers, she was competent and unremarkable, someone who filed reports on time and never pushed boundaries. But to certain colonels and majors who'd come up through fighter squadrons, who'd never flown anything as ugly or slow as the Warthog, she was a reminder of everything the Air Force was supposedly trying to leave behind. Old iron, cheap, inelegant, the kind of platform that required actual work rather than letting technology do the flying. When her name appeared on the combat roster, the air boss had felt his jaw tighten reflexively, that old prejudice rising like bile, but he'd pushed it down because right now the SEALs didn't care about airframes or academy rankings. They cared about staying alive. Marin's hands moved across the controls with practiced economy, trimming airspeed, adjusting altitude, her eyes scanning the terrain through the canopy, while her right thumb hovered near the weapon's release. The A-10 descended through 8,000 feet, nose angling down toward the valley floor where smoke from small arms fire drifted in lazy columns against the mountain backdrop. The turbofan engines mounted high on the fuselage whined their distinctive pitch, a sound that made insurgents scatter and friendlies exhale with relief, though no one back at Bagram would admit the latter in polite company. She toggled her radio. Reaper 2-1 to ground element, authenticate Bravo 6. The response came back instantly, the correct code followed by grid coordinates and a terse description of enemy positions. Marin's eyes narrowed, processing information faster than her instruments could display it. 12 hostiles in 3 groups, staggered elevation, overlapping fields of fire. The SEALs were dug into a dried riverbed with maybe 30 meters of cover, which meant any aircraft making a gun run would be threading through mountain walls with almost no margin for error. It was the kind of approach that looked suicidal on paper and felt worse in practice. She banked the A-10 into a hard turn, feeling the GS press against her ribs, watching the altimeter unwind as the valley rushed up to meet her. Her left hand adjusted throttle while her right steadied on the stick, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought would be too slow. The targeting pod slaved to her helmet display, painting infrared signatures across her visor, the cool blue of rocks and earth, the hot white of human bodies pressed against boulders. She counted positions, calculated angles, estimated the blast radius of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon mounted in the aircraft's nose. 7 barrels, 30-millimeter rounds, depleted uranium penetrators designed to shred Soviet tanks. Against human targets in the open, it was biblical. She toggled through weapons options, considering the Maverick missiles under her wings, but dismissed the thought immediately. Too much collateral, too much risk of debris reaching the SEAL position. This would be guns only, which meant getting close enough to see faces, close enough to count regrets. The insurgents saw her coming, small arms fire stitching lines of tracer rounds through the afternoon sky, bright and almost pretty if you didn't think about what they could do to hydraulic lines or control surfaces. Marin adjusted her angle 5 degrees, compensating for wind shear off the mountains, her breathing steady and controlled. The first group was clustered near an outcropping 200 meters above the riverbed, using elevation for advantage, their weapons trained downward on the pinned Americans. She armed the cannon, felt the slight vibration as the system spun up, and squeezed the trigger in a 2-second burst. The sound was catastrophic, a roar that drowned out thought itself, and the recoil actually slowed the aircraft despite its 11 tons of armored mass. Downrange, the mountainside erupted in dust and pulverized rock, 30-millimeter rounds impacting at 70 per second, and when the cloud cleared, the outcropping was empty, scarred, smoking. The SEALs didn't cheer. They were already repositioning, using the brief reprieve to adjust their perimeter. Marin pulled up hard, the aircraft groaning as she climbed, trading speed for altitude, already lining up her next approach. The air boss watched the data link, saw her altitude drop below parameters, saw her airspeed flirt with stall thresholds, and felt his hands grip the edge of the console. Someone beside him muttered that she was flying too aggressive, taking too many risks, that any second the aircraft would auger in or catch a lucky round through something critical. But the air boss didn't respond because he was watching something else. The way her flight path carved through threat rings with geometric precision, the way each gun run started exactly where the last one ended, creating overlapping fields of suppression that kept the insurgents from resetting their positions. It wasn't reckless. It was calculated violence executed with the kind of skill that only came from understanding your aircraft at a level most pilots never reached. The second group opened fire as she descended again, and this time something hit a sharp metallic crack followed by a yellow warning light on her panel. Hydraulic pressure dropping in the secondary system. Not critical yet, but trending that direction. Marin ignored the warning, focused on the targeting reticle as it drifted across her display, waiting for the exact moment when mathematics and instinct aligned. She fired again, another burst, shorter this time to conserve ammunition, and watched the rounds impact with surgical precision along a ridgeline where muzzle flashes had been strobing seconds before. The insurgents scattered, some of them not fast enough, and she banked away before the terrain could close around her like a fist. The SEALs used the opening to move, bounding forward in pairs, professional and unhurried despite the circumstances. Their team leader, a senior chief with 15 years and a chest full of ribbons he never wore, keyed his radio with hands that didn't shake. Reaper 2-1, you're keeping us alive. We're moving to secondary position, 300 meters northeast. Marin acknowledged with a single click, already adjusting her pattern, her eyes tracking movement on the ground through thermals and optics. The third group was the problem. They'd repositioned during her last run, spread out across multiple covered positions with interlocking fields of fire. Smart, disciplined, not the usual pattern. She climbed to 4,000 feet, buying herself space to think, to plan. The hydraulic pressure had stabilized but not recovered, which meant she was operating on degraded systems with reduced redundancy. The fuel gauge showed enough for maybe 3 more hard runs before she'd have to break off for tanker support. The ammunition counter read 240 rounds remaining in the cannon. She did the math in her head: 60 seconds of trigger time if she used short bursts, less if she had to sustain fire. The senior chief's voice came through again, quieter now, almost conversational. "We've got 2 down, both stable but need medevac within the hour. Can you keep them off us?" Marin didn't hesitate, didn't calculate odds or survival probabilities. "Affirm, not going anywhere." She rolled the A-10 inverted, pulled the nose down toward the earth, and dove back into the valley where smoke and dust hung like curtains and men with guns waited for her to make a mistake. The altimeter unwound fast: 3,000, 2,000, 1,500, the mountains rising on either side like walls closing in. She leveled out barely 200 feet above the valley floor, the aircraft shaking as it punched through turbulent air, her hand steady on the stick. The third group opened fire simultaneously, coordinated, disciplined. Tracer rounds converged from multiple angles, and something punched through the left wing, leaving a hole the size of a fist just inboard of the pylon. The aircraft shuddered but held together. The A-10 was designed for exactly this, built around the cannon with redundant systems and titanium armor that could absorb punishment that would disintegrate other airframes. She lined up on the nearest position, a cluster of fighters using a burned-out technical as cover, and squeezed the trigger. The cannon spoke its violent language, and the technical disintegrated along with the men behind it. She pulled up immediately, trading altitude for survival, another warning light flickering on her panel. Primary hydraulic system now degraded. She was flying on backups and willpower. The SEALs were moving again, using each gun run as cover for their advance, working toward a position where extraction helicopters could actually reach them without getting shredded. The senior chief's voice came through with an edge of urgency. "Reaper 2-1, we've got technical inbound from the north. Possible reinforcements." Marin checked her fuel, checked her ammunition, checked the warning lights multiplying across her panel like plague markers, and made a decision that would define everything that followed. She didn't call for backup, didn't request support, didn't calculate whether the mission was worth her airframe or her life. She simply rolled into another dive, steeper this time, nose pointed at coordinates where dust trails indicated approaching vehicles. The technical came into view through her targeting display, a Toyota pickup with a heavy machine gun welded to the bed, racing across open ground toward the SEAL position. She armed her last Maverick missile, waited for lock, and released. The missile dropped away clean, motor igniting, white smoke trail arcing downward as it guided itself toward thermal signature. Impact was instantaneous, a flash of orange and black, debris fountaining outward, and when it cleared, nothing remained but a crater and burning metal. The ammunition counter read 90 rounds. The fuel gauge was bleeding toward minimums. Every warning light on the panel was now illuminated, a Christmas tree of system failures and degraded capabilities. The senior chief's voice was different now, carrying something that might have been awe or might have been guilt. "Reaper 2-1, your danger close on fuel. We can hold until backup arrives." Marin glanced at her instruments, did the math, knew he was right. But she also knew what happened when air support broke off, knew how quickly confidence could collapse into panic, knew that these men had families and futures that hinged on the next 10 minutes. She keyed her radio, voice calm despite the alarms screaming in her headset. "Negative. I've got time." It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that kept people alive, the kind that traded personal safety for collective survival. She turned back toward the valley, aircraft groaning, systems failing, hydraulic fluid leaving a thin mist behind her. The remaining insurgents had consolidated positions, recognizing they were losing, preparing for a final stand that would cost as much as possible. They fired in disciplined volleys, tracers crossing through the air where they thought she'd fly, trying to anticipate her pattern. But Marin had stopped being predictable 3 runs ago. She came in from the east instead of the south, low and fast, using terrain masking to hide her approach until the last possible second. When she emerged from behind a ridgeline, she was barely 50 feet off the deck, the A-10's shadow racing across rocks and scrub. She fired her remaining ammunition in one sustained burst, walking the rounds across enemy positions with mechanical precision, the cannon's roar echoing off mountain walls. Brass casings rained down, glittering in afternoon sun, and when the trigger clicked empty, the valley floor was silent except for wind and distant groaning metal. The SEALs stood slowly from their positions, scanning for threats, finding none. The senior chief keyed his radio one more time, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what had just happened. Reaper 2-1, targets destroyed. You're cleared from station. And ma'am, thank you doesn't cover it. Marin banked away from the valley, climbing on failing systems. Hydraulic fluid now streaming visibly from damaged lines, the aircraft responding sluggishly to inputs. She aimed for Bagram, 60 miles west, trying not to think about whether her landing gear would deploy, or whether the runway would come up too fast with degraded controls. The operations center tracked her approach, watching altitude and airspeed fluctuate wildly as she fought to keep the wounded bird airborne. The air boss stood motionless, staring at the radar return, his earlier prejudices evaporating like morning frost under hard sun. When she called final approach, her voice was still steady, still professional, still utterly calm despite flying an aircraft that should have been breaking apart. She touched down hard, too fast, hydraulics screaming, and the landing gear held just long enough for her to roll out before collapsing in a shower of sparks and grinding metal. The A-10 slid to a stop halfway down the runway, nose tilted at an angle, smoke rising from a dozen damaged systems, looking less like a combat aircraft and more like a monument to improbable survival. Fire crews were rolling before she'd even shut down the engines. Marin sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands still on the controls, breathing deeply, coming down from the chemical high of combat and adrenaline. When she finally climbed out, stepping down onto the wing and then to the tarmac, the maintainers surrounded her with expressions mixing relief and horror at what she'd brought back. The crew chief, a master sergeant named Kowalski who'd been turning wrenches for 23 years, walked a slow circle around the aircraft, counting holes, assessing damage, occasionally shaking his head. 27 bullet impacts, both hydraulic systems compromised, one engine running on prayers, control surfaces shot to hell. Landing gear that had given its last full measure. He turned to Marin with something like reverence. "Ma'am, I've seen aircraft come back from missions. This thing came back from a wake." She managed a tired smile, pulled off her helmet, ran fingers through sweat-soaked hair. She flew good right up until she didn't. The air boss arrived in a Humvee, climbing out with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested he was still processing what he'd witnessed. He approached Marin, and she straightened unconsciously, exhausted body finding correct military bearing through sheer habit. He studied her for a moment, this captain with Nebraska in her voice, and 11 years of service that had been consistently overlooked because she flew an airframe people didn't respect. He'd been one of those people. Had dismissed her as competent but unremarkable, a pilot who would never set records or earn headlines, who would retire after 20 years with a respectable record and no particular distinction. He'd been catastrophically wrong. "Captain Voss," he said, and his voice carried an edge of formality that made the surrounding personnel quiet down. "That was the finest display of close air support I've witnessed in 26 years of service. I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and I'm going to make sure every pilot on this base knows your call sign and what it means." Marin's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes, surprise maybe, or vindication, or simply exhaustion too deep for words to penetrate. "Thank you, sir. Just doing the job." The air boss shook his head slowly. "No, that wasn't the job. That was something else entirely." He paused, glanced at the damaged A-10, then back at her. "Why Reaper?" It was a question others had asked before, usually with mild curiosity, sometimes with poorly concealed mockery. The call sign Reaper sounded aggressive, overwrought, like someone trying too hard to cultivate an image. Fighter jocks chose names like Viper or Ace. Attack pilots usually ended up with something more prosaic, more grounded. But Marin had chosen Reaper deliberately, for reasons she rarely explained. She was quiet for a moment, considering whether to give the real answer or the deflection she usually offered. She chose honesty. My father was a wheat farmer in Nebraska, spent his life on a John Deere combine, harvesting fields when the timing was right. He used to say that a good reaper knows when to move, when to wait, when to press hard, and when to back off. He said harvesting wasn't about speed or force, it was about reading conditions and making the right call at the right moment. She glanced back at her aircraft, still smoking, still broken, but still whole enough to have brought her home. I figured if I was going to fly close air support, if I was going to be responsible for people on the ground, I'd better be as good at reading situations as he was at reading fields. So, Reaper. The air boss nodded slowly, understanding something fundamental that he'd missed before, that probably a lot of people had missed. Call signs were supposed to be jokes or insults or random assignments, but sometimes they were statements of purpose, promises made to yourself about who you intended to be. He thought about recommending her for aircraft upgrade, maybe transition her to something newer, faster, more prestigious. But as he watched her rest one hand on the battle-damaged Warthog's fuselage with unconscious affection, he realized she wouldn't want that. She'd found her place in this ugly, slow, magnificent machine that nobody respected until they needed it. "Get some rest, Captain. We'll debrief in 6 hours." She nodded, exhaustion finally beginning to show in the set of her shoulders, the slight slowness of her movements. She walked away from the aircraft, leaving Kowalski and his crew to begin the long process of assessment and repair, leaving the air boss standing beside a monument to skill and determination, and the kind of flying that didn't require afterburners or supersonic speeds to be extraordinary. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and somewhere in that valley 60 miles east, 12 Navy SEALs were boarding helicopters for extraction, alive because of decisions made at 400 knots and 200 feet. News traveled fast on military bases, faster than official communications, spreading through informal networks of friendship and professional respect. By evening chow, every pilot on Bagram knew the story in rough outline. Reaper 2-1 pulling SEALs out of an impossible situation, flying a shot-to-hell A-10 back on failing systems, landing with gear that collapsed on rollout. The details were still fuzzy, exaggerated in some tellings, understated in others, but the core truth remained consistent. Captain Marin Voss had done something remarkable, and the aircraft commanders who'd spent years dismissing her as adequate but unremarkable were now recalibrating their assessments with varying degrees of grace. In the officers' club, a major who flew F-16s and had opinions about every pilot on base sat nursing a beer, listening to a maintainer describe the damage to Reaper 2-1, 27 holes, both hydraulic systems compromised, control surfaces barely functional. The major set down his beer with the careful precision of someone reassessing fundamental assumptions. "How the hell did she land that?" The maintainer, a technical sergeant with grease under his fingernails and no patience for officer politics, gave him a flat look. "Skill. Same way she kept those SEALs alive. Skill and guts and knowing her aircraft better than you know your own name." The major wanted to argue, wanted to point out that any competent pilot could have done the same, that it was training and procedures and luck more than individual talent. But he'd seen the flight data, watched the replay from the Predator feed, observed the way she'd threaded through terrain that should have killed her on 3 separate occasions. He stayed quiet, which for him was a form of concession. Marin ate dinner alone in her quarters, too tired for the social performance of the chow hall, too wired to sleep despite exhaustion that made her hands shake when she tried to hold her fork. She kept replaying the mission in mental loops, identifying mistakes, calculating alternative approaches, the endless self-critique that separated good pilots from excellent ones. She should have anticipated the third group's repositioning, should have conserved more ammunition early, should have climbed faster after the first gun run to maintain better situational awareness. The fact that 12 men were alive and headed home to families didn't erase the tactical errors she'd made, the inefficiencies in her execution. She was sitting there in that recursive spiral of analysis when someone knocked on her door. She considered ignoring it, but military courtesy was reflexive. She opened the door to find the senior chief from the SEAL team, still in his combat gear, dust and cordite stains visible on his uniform. He was shorter than she expected, maybe 5'9", with gray threading through his beard and eyes that had seen too much but somehow kept looking anyway. "Captain Voss, mind if I come in?" She stepped aside, suddenly aware of her quarter's modest disorder flight manuals stacked on the desk, civilian clothes draped over a chair, a framed photo of Nebraska wheat fields on the shelf. He glanced around briefly, then focused on her with uncomfortable intensity. "I wanted to thank you in person." Without the radio buffer, Marin felt awkward, unused to this kind of direct gratitude, more comfortable with professional distance. "Just doing my job, Senior Chief. Glad you're all safe." He shook his head slowly, deliberately. "No, we both know that's not what happened. You flew through fire with a dying aircraft and stayed on station when you should have left. My guys are alive because you decided our lives were worth more than procedures or safety margins." He paused, seemed to be choosing words carefully. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I've worked with a lot of pilots. Most are good. Some are great. You're something else. You're someone who understands that numbers on a screen are people with families, and you fly like that matters." Marin didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, just nodded slightly. The senior chief reached into his pocket, pulled out a small object, and held it out. "This is my team coin. We don't give these out casually. I want you to have it." She took it, feeling the weight in her palm, brass, slightly worn, with the SEAL trident on one side and the team designation on the other. It felt heavier than its physical mass, weighted with meaning she couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she managed, and meant it. He nodded, turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing. What you did today is going to follow you. People are going to have opinions, make assumptions. Some will say you were reckless. Others will try to make you a hero. Don't let either one change who you are." Then he was gone, leaving her standing in her quarters, holding a piece of brass and feeling the weight of recognition she'd never actively sought. She set the coin on her desk next to the photo of Nebraska fields and tried to process the strange dissonance of being seen after years of being overlooked. Outside, the base continued its evening routine, helicopters launching for night operations, maintainers working under floodlights, the endless machinery of war grinding forward without pause or sentiment. The debriefing happened at midnight in a secure room with harsh fluorescent lighting that made everyone look exhausted regardless of actual fatigue levels. Marin sat across from the air boss, two intelligence officers, and a colonel from wing operations who'd made the trip from Kandahar specifically for this. They walked through the mission minute by minute, her explanations technical and precise, her tone professional despite exhaustion that made her thoughts feel like they were moving through water. The intelligence officers wanted to know about enemy capabilities, numbers, equipment. The colonel wanted to understand her decision-making process, why she'd stayed on station with failing systems, whether she'd considered the strategic implications of losing both pilot and aircraft. Marin answered each question directly, honestly, without embellishment or self-justification. She described her assessment of the tactical situation, the calculations about ammunition and fuel, the moment when she decided that retreating would likely result in American casualties. The colonel leaned back, studying her with an expression that might have been respect or might have been something more complicated. "You understand you violated several procedures. You should have requested backup when your hydraulic system failed. You definitely should have left when it became apparent your landing gear was compromised." Marin met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir, I understand. At the time, backup was 20 minutes out and the ground element had maybe 5 minutes before being overrun. I made the call that saving the team was worth the risk to my aircraft and myself." The colonel was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That's the call I would have made too. That's also the call that ends careers if it goes wrong." He glanced at the air boss. "We're forwarding this to higher command for formal review. I'm recommending Captain Voss for the Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor device. I'm also recommending she receive formal recognition from Naval Special Warfare Command." He turned back to Marin. You should know that you're probably going to get pulled into the public relations machine. Medal ceremonies, interviews, the whole circus. If you want to decline that aspect, I'll support you, but the Navy is going to want to make noise about this. Marin felt something tighten in her chest, that reflexive discomfort with attention, with being visible in ways that invited scrutiny. "Can I think about it, sir?" The colonel smiled slightly, the first real expression she'd seen from him. "You can. But Captain, and I mean this with all respect, what you did today matters beyond just those 12 men. You proved something about capability and judgment that a lot of people needed to see proven. Don't hide from that." The debriefing ended near 0200, and Marin walked back to her quarters through darkness punctuated by floodlights and the distant sound of generators. She was thinking about Nebraska, about her father on his combine, about the way he could look at a wheat field and know exactly when it was ready, when waiting another day would mean loss and acting too soon would mean waste. She tried to bring that same intuition to flying, to combat, to the impossible decisions that came with being responsible for other people's survival. She wasn't sure if it was working or if she'd just been lucky, but 12 men were going home, and maybe that was the only metric that actually mattered. She slept for 4 hours, dreams fragmented with images of mountains and smoke and warning lights multiplying like bacteria. When she woke, there was a message from Wing Command. Report to operations at 0900 for temporary reassignment. She showed up exactly on time, uniform pressed despite having only 30 minutes to prepare, to find the air boss waiting with an expression that mixed bureaucratic formality with something approaching genuine concern. "Captain, we're pulling you off combat rotation for 72 hours. Mandatory crew rest and psychological evaluation following major incident." Marin felt her jaw tighten but kept her expression neutral. "Sir, I'm fit to fly. I'd rather get back on the rotation." The air boss shook his head. "I know, but this isn't negotiable. You flew a critically damaged aircraft through combat conditions while operating on degraded systems. Regulations require evaluation before return to flight status." He paused, softened slightly. "Also, Kowalski estimates minimum 3 weeks before your bird is mission-ready again. So even if I wanted to put you back up, you don't have an aircraft." That was harder to argue with. Marin nodded slowly, accepting the inevitable. "Understood, sir." She spent the mandatory 72 hours in a strange limbo, attending perfunctory sessions with the base psychologist who asked careful questions about stress and decision-making, and whether she experienced intrusive thoughts. She answered honestly. Yes, she replayed the mission obsessively, but that was normal self-critique rather than trauma. Yes, she thought about what could have gone wrong, but that's how you learn from experience. No, she didn't regret her decisions, though she'd identified several tactical improvements for future reference. The psychologist made notes, asked more questions, eventually cleared her for flight with a recommendation for follow-up in 30 days. The Air Force's concern for her mental state felt both genuine and performative, box-checking that satisfied regulations, without really addressing the fundamental strangeness of violence as a profession. The medal ceremony happened 6 weeks later at Bagram, orchestrated by public affairs with the kind of attention to detail usually reserved for change of command formations. They'd flown in the SEAL team, all 12 of them in their dress uniforms looking uncomfortable with the formality. The Distinguished Flying Cross came in a blue box lined with white satin, the medal itself bronze and blue ribbon, weight of national recognition reduced to 2 ounces of metal and cloth. The wing commander pinned it to her uniform while cameras recorded for official documentation and probably recruitment videos. The senior chief stood in the front row, and when the citation was read, aloud describing her actions in language that felt simultaneously too grand and too inadequate, she saw him nod slightly, affirming the accuracy beneath the ceremony's theatrical presentation. Afterward, there was a reception with coffee and cookies that nobody wanted, but everyone ate out of social obligation. Fighter pilots congratulated her with enthusiasm that ranged from genuine to performative, and she accepted each handshake with professional grace while internally calculating how soon she could escape. A major who flew F-15Es cornered her by the coffee station, his tone confidential, almost conspiratorial. "Voss, I've got to ask, what's it like flying the Hog? I mean really flying it, not the propaganda version." She considered the question, the genuine curiosity beneath it, the way he was actually listening rather than waiting to talk. "It's like farming," she said finally. "You have to read conditions constantly, adjust for variables you can't control, and understand that raw power matters less than timing and precision. The A-10 isn't fast or pretty, but it's honest. It does exactly what you tell it to do, and it brings you home even when home seems impossible." The major nodded slowly, processing that. "I always thought of it as the ugly duckling, but maybe that's the point." She smiled slightly. "Every aircraft is ugly until you need it. Then it's the most beautiful thing in the world." That conversation, more than the medal or the ceremony or the official recognition, felt like progress, someone actually trying to understand rather than categorize or dismiss. She stayed at the reception the required hour, then escaped back to her quarters where she hung the medal on a shelf next to the SEAL team coin and the photo of Nebraska wheat fields. Three objects representing different forms of recognition, different ways of being seen. She preferred the coin. Days blended into weeks, routine missions interspersed with the aftermath of recognition. Her call sign carried different weight now when air controllers assigned her missions. Ground forces requested her specifically for danger close support. Other pilots asked questions about technique and decision-making with genuine interest rather than polite dismissal. Kowalski and his crew had rebuilt Reaper 2-1 with the kind of obsessive precision usually reserved for museum restorations. They'd patched every hole, replaced both hydraulic systems, rebuilt the landing gear from scratch. When they unveiled it after 3 weeks, the aircraft looked almost factory new except for one detail. Kowalski had painted 27 small silhouettes on the fuselage beneath the canopy, one for each bullet hole, permanent record of what the aircraft had survived. Marin ran her hand over them, feeling paint texture under her fingertips, unexpected emotion tightening her throat. "You didn't have to do this." Kowalski shrugged, uncomfortable with sentiment but committed to the gesture. "Aircraft that keeps a pilot alive deserves to be remembered. Besides, next time some fighter jock talks trash about the Warthog, we can point to this and ask what their airframe has survived." She flew her first post-incident mission 3 days later, a routine patrol that stayed routine, no emergencies or drama or opportunities for heroism. Just hours of watching terrain scroll past, of being ready for problems that never materialized, the grinding mundanity that comprised 90% of combat aviation. It felt exactly right. Flying wasn't supposed to be constantly dramatic. It was supposed to be professionally executed preparation, interrupted by occasional moments of intensity. She was good at both parts, and finally people were noticing. The Navy SEAL team sent a formal letter through official channels, thanking her for her actions and requesting her presence at their team compound for a ceremonial dinner. She almost declined, uncomfortable with prolonged attention, but the senior chief called her personally and pointed out that saying no would actually create more awkwardness than accepting. So she went, flying down to their compound in civilian clothes, feeling out of place among operators whose culture was completely different from Air Force protocols. They treated her like family, though, with the easy informality that came from shared experience and mutual respect. They told stories about other missions, other close calls, creating context that transformed her actions from unique heroism into professional competence executed under pressure. It was exactly the perspective she needed. Over dinner steak and potatoes, because SEALs apparently had strong opinions about meat, the senior chief raised a glass. To Reaper 2-1, who proved that the most important capability in combat aviation isn't speed or stealth, it's giving a damn. 12 men raised their glasses, and Marin felt that strange dissonance again, being recognized for caring about something she'd never thought required recognition. Of course she cared. They were people. What else would she do? The evening ended with informal conversation, war stories traded with the kind of dark humor that military professionals use to process horror without being consumed by it. One of the younger SEALs, barely 23 with a Nevada accent and shrapnel scars on his forearm, approached her as people were leaving. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" She nodded. "Why do you fly the A-10? You've got the credentials for any aircraft. Why choose the slow one?" She'd been asked variations of this question before, usually by people who assumed there must be some deficit not good enough for fighters, not interested in advancement, content with mediocrity. But this kid was asking differently, like he actually wanted to understand. "Because close air support isn't about me," she said simply. "It's about the people on the ground who need someone to show up when everything's gone wrong. The A-10 is built for that specific mission. It's designed around the gun, armored for survivability, capable of operating from damaged runways or forward positions. It's not glamorous, but it's exactly what the mission requires." The kid nodded, processing that. "That's how we think about our job, too. It's not about being a hero. It's about being where you're needed when you're needed," she smiled. "Exactly." Flying back to Bagram that night, she thought about her father again, about the combine in the wheat fields, about the philosophy of being useful rather than impressive. She'd spent 11 years in service, most of them being competent but invisible, doing good work that nobody particularly noticed. One mission had changed that, thrust her into visibility she'd never sought. But the core remained the same: reading conditions, making good calls, staying on station until the job was done. Everything else was just noise. The weeks turned into months, deployment cycle winding toward completion. Marin flew another 47 missions during that rotation, none of them as dramatic as the SEAL rescue, most of them entirely routine. She provided overwatch for convoy movements, conducted presence patrols along the Pakistani border, performed show-of-force demonstrations that hopefully prevented fighting rather than concluded it. Each mission was different but fundamentally similar: preparation, execution, return. The rhythm of professional competence applied consistently. Her reputation preceded her now in ways both helpful and occasionally irritating. Ground commanders requested her specifically, which meant getting tasked with the highest-risk missions. Other pilots asked for advice, with a deference that felt unearned given that they were all professionals doing the same job. The administrative machinery of recognition ground forward additional awards, qualification upgrades, selection for command development programs she'd never previously been considered for. She accepted what was mandatory and politely declined what wasn't, trying to maintain the focus that had gotten her here in the first place. The deployment ended in October, the season when Afghanistan's mountains began their transition from brutal heat to brutal cold. The squadron rotated back to Davis-Monthan in Arizona, returning to the strange normality of peacetime routine after months of combat operations. Marin found herself back in the same apartment she'd left 6 months earlier, everything exactly as she'd left it, as if the intervening time had been a dream or alternate timeline. But she'd changed, even if the furniture hadn't. She'd been seen, been recognized, been validated in ways that 11 years of solid performance had never achieved. It felt both gratifying and slightly hollow, like realizing the game had different rules than she'd been taught. She visited her father in Nebraska during post-deployment leave, driving rental car through autumn fields where combines were harvesting wheat in long parallel lines. He was 71 now, still running the farm with the help of 2 hired hands, still starting work at dawn because that's what the wheat required. They sat on the porch after dinner, watching sunset paint the fields in shades of amber, and she told him about the mission, about the SEALs, about flying a damaged aircraft home through sheer determination and intimate knowledge of her machine. He listened without interruption, then nodded slowly. "Sounds like you read the situation right. Knew when to press, knew when to hold. That's all farming is, really. All anything is." She smiled, feeling vindication she hadn't known she needed. "They gave me a medal for it." He glanced at her, expression thoughtful. "That's nice. Did you bring those men home safe?" "I did." "Then you've got the only validation that matters." They sat in comfortable silence, watching combines move across distant fields, and Marin felt the dissonance resolve slightly. The medal was nice, the recognition was gratifying, but the senior chief's handshake and those 12 men going home to families, that was the actual accomplishment. Everything else was just ceremony. She returned to Davis-Monthan, to the routine of training flights and simulator hours, and the bureaucratic grind of peacetime Air Force. The Distinguished Flying Cross sat in a shadow box on her wall, visible but not prominent, acknowledgement of a moment when training and instinct and determination had aligned perfectly. She flew training missions with new pilots, passing on lessons learned through experience rather than just instruction. She talked about reading terrain, about understanding your aircraft's limitations, about the philosophy of being useful rather than impressive. Some of them listened with genuine interest. Others nodded politely and ignored her advice in favor of pursuing fighter slots, and the glory they imagined came with speed and afterburners. She didn't judge either group. Everyone had to find their own path to competence. The senior chief stayed in touch, occasional emails with no particular content updates on team members, photos of training exercises, the casual maintenance of connection between people who'd shared intensity without quite becoming friends. Marin appreciated the contact without needing it to be more than it was. Professional respect could exist without social intimacy, and that felt appropriate for the relationship. A year after the deployment, she was promoted to major and assigned as Assistant Director of Operations for her squadron. It was a career progression moment, moving from individual contributor to leadership, from flying missions to planning them. She accepted the responsibility with characteristic professionalism, recognizing that growth required uncomfortable transitions. She was good at flying. She'd need to learn to be good at command. Her call sign followed her, though, attached now to reputation rather than just personal identifier. New pilots arriving at Davis-Monthan heard stories about Reaper 2-1 before they met her, often inflated through retelling, sometimes distorted into mythology rather than fact. She corrected the worst exaggerations when she encountered them, but mostly let people believe what they wanted. Reputation was useful for establishing credibility. Accuracy was less important than the underlying truth that she was competent and reliable. The A-10 community remained small, insular, populated by pilots who'd chosen capability over prestige, who understood that effectiveness mattered more than perception. Marin found her home there, among people who valued the same things she did, who understood that glory was accidental and usually irrelevant. They flew their ugly, slow, magnificent aircraft and brought people home, and that was the entire point. 3 years after the SEAL rescue, she was selected for Squadron Command, taking over a unit preparing for deployment to support operations in Syria. It was the career milestone that marked transition from technician to leader, from executing missions to enabling others to execute them. She accepted the position with the same deliberate preparation she brought to everything, studying leadership philosophy and personnel management, and the administrative machinery that enabled combat operations. Her father died that winter, quietly in his sleep at 74. The farm sold to a corporate agricultural company that would operate it with GPS-guided equipment and no human intuition. Marin took emergency leave, flew to Nebraska for the funeral, stood in a small church while a pastor who'd known her father for 50 years talked about dedication and reading the land and the quiet dignity of work done well. She thought about combines and wheat fields and the philosophy of being useful, about lessons passed down in form if not explicit instruction. She returned to Davis-Monthan carrying her father's wedding ring in her pocket, physical reminder of legacy, and the passage of knowledge between generations. She wore it on a chain around her neck during flights, hidden beneath her flight suit, private acknowledgement of foundation and instruction. The deployment to Syria was different from Afghanistan, different terrain, different enemy, different political constraints on engagement. Marin commanded her squadron through 9 months of operations, managing personnel and maintenance, and the endless friction between what missions required and what regulations allowed. She flew when appropriate but mostly stayed on the ground, enabling other pilots to execute the work she'd once done herself. It was harder than she expected, watching others take risks she would have managed differently, restraining the impulse to directly intervene in situations she'd have approached with alternative tactics. But that was the nature of command, trusting people to execute according to their judgment, providing guidance without micromanagement, accepting that there were multiple paths to competence. Her squadron performed well, no casualties, no major incidents, solid execution of complex missions under difficult conditions. It wasn't dramatic, which meant it was exactly right. They returned stateside in June, sunburned and exhausted and professionally satisfied with work done competently under pressure. Marin was promoted to lieutenant colonel 2 years later, moved to wing operations where she oversaw multiple squadrons and began influencing policy rather than just execution. It was further from flying, deeper into bureaucracy, but still fundamentally about enabling people to execute missions effectively. She brought the same philosophy to leadership that she'd brought to flying: read conditions carefully, make good calls, stay focused on the actual mission rather than performance theater. Some people appreciated the approach. Others found it insufficiently ambitious, too grounded in practical effectiveness rather than strategic vision. She didn't particularly care which group was larger. 4 years after that, she made colonel, assigned to Air Combat Command Headquarters, where she shaped doctrine and training standards for the entire close air support community. She was 49 years old, 28 years in service, impossibly far from the captain who'd flown a Shattup through the Hindu Kush. But the core remained the same: competence applied with care, decisions made with recognition that numbers on screens represented people with families. She retired at 51 with full ceremony and a wall full of awards that represented moments when somebody had noticed what she was doing. The Distinguished Flying Cross remained her favorite, not for what it said about her, but for what it represented: 12 men going home, mission accomplished, work done right. She moved back to Nebraska, bought a small house near where her father's farm had been, spent her days reading and hiking, and occasionally consulting for Air Force training programs. The quiet felt earned, aftermath of decades spent in noise and urgency and the endless pressure of responsibility. Sometimes she dreamed about flying, about the valley in Helmand where everything had changed, about the feeling of an aircraft responding to her inputs despite impossible damage. She'd wake with her heart racing, hands gripping imaginary controls, muscle memory insisting the mission wasn't finished. Then she'd remember it was finished. It had been finished years ago. The men had gone home. The aircraft had been repaired and was still flying somewhere, probably with a new pilot who'd never know its history. The work had been done right, and nothing else really mattered. She lived quietly for 18 months before the diagnosis: stage 4 pancreatic cancer, discovered too late for intervention, prognosis measured in months rather than years. She received the news with the same steady calm she'd brought to every crisis, processing information, calculating options, accepting reality without denial or rage. Her oncologist offered treatment options that might extend survival by weeks, and she declined all of them. She'd spent 30 years preparing for death in various forms. When it finally arrived, she'd meet it on her terms. The Air Force sent representatives offering support, asking if there was anything she needed. She requested one thing: permission to visit Davis-Monthan once more, to see the A-10s, to remember what it had felt like when flying was her purpose rather than her past. They arranged it immediately, flew her to Arizona, gave her unrestricted access to the flight line. She walked among the aircraft with Kowalski, who'd retired as a chief master sergeant but still contracted as a civilian maintainer, still turning wrenches on the aircraft he'd loved for 37 years. They found her old bird, tail number still visible despite multiple paint cycles, those 27 silhouettes still marked beneath the canopy. Kowalski had fought bureaucracy to keep them there, arguing they were historical documentation rather than unauthorized decoration. He'd won, which meant the aircraft carried its scars as visible reminder of survival and competence. Marin ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling rivets and panel lines, metal warm under afternoon sun. "She's still flying," Kowalski nodded. "Different pilot now, but yeah, still mission capable, still bringing people home." She smiled, satisfied with that continuity. "Good, that's what she's built for." She died 3 weeks later in a hospice in Nebraska, morphine managing pain until consciousness faded into something gentler. She was alone by choice, having declined visitors except for a few specific people. The senior chief from the SEAL team, Kowalski, a handful of pilots she'd commanded or mentored. They came, stayed briefly, said things that mattered more for being unsaid than spoken aloud. The Air Force buried her with full honors at Arlington, 3 volleys and a flag, and a ceremony attended by people who'd known her and many who'd only known her reputation. The senior chief gave a eulogy that avoided cliché, describing her as someone who'd understood that heroism was just competence applied with care when consequences were severe. Several of his team members attended, middle-aged now with families and lives that existed because she'd stayed on station when she should have left. They stood in dress uniforms and watched her casket descend into earth, and some of them wept because gratitude doesn't expire with time. The Air Force dedicated a building at Davis-Monthan in her name, a training facility where new A-10 pilots learned close air support doctrine and technique. Her Distinguished Flying Cross was displayed in a glass case near the entrance, alongside a photo of her in flight gear, and a plaque describing her actions in clinical military language that somehow missed the actual point. But below the medal, someone had added the SEAL team coin and a small piece of brass inscribed with words from her father's philosophy. "A good reaper knows when to move, when to wait, when to press hard, and when to back off." Students walked past it daily, most barely noticing, some pausing to read and consider. The ones who paused, who wondered about the woman behind the hardware and ceremony, those were the ones who might understand what mattered: competence with care, judgment under pressure. The courage to stay when leaving was safer. Reaper 21's call sign became unofficial tradition among A-10 pilots, invoked when missions were difficult and consequences severe. "Fly it like Reaper" meant executing with precision and determination regardless of cost. It meant understanding that numbers represented people. It meant staying until the job was done. The actual woman behind the legend was mostly forgotten, collapsed into archetype and simplification, which is what happens to everyone eventually. But the principles remained, encoded in culture and training, passed down through generations of pilots who needed to learn that effectiveness mattered more than appearance, that ugly aircraft flown well beat beautiful aircraft flown poorly, that sometimes the most important thing was simply showing up when nobody else would. Years later, a young captain named Rodriguez, flying her first combat mission in an A-10, found herself in a situation that felt impossible: ground unit pinned down, ammunition critical, her aircraft damaged and systems failing. She thought about ejecting, about calling for backup, about all the reasons she should leave station and return for repair. Then she thought about a colonel she'd never met, a call sign that had become legend, a philosophy about reading conditions and making good calls. She stayed. She worked the problem. She brought the ground unit home. Later, when people asked her how she'd managed it, she said it was just training and procedures, nothing special. Anyone would have done the same, but she knew better. She'd learned from someone who'd understood that anyone would have done the same was false modesty covering an essential truth most people wouldn't have. Most people would have left. Staying required something extra, something that couldn't be taught explicitly but could be modeled and absorbed through example. The line between competence and cowardice wasn't about skill or training. It was about deciding that other people's lives were worth your risk, that duty meant something beyond personal safety, that effectiveness required being willing to pay costs others would avoid. Rodriguez received her own medal eventually, her own recognition and reputation, and the strange experience of being seen after being invisible. She hung the medal on her wall next to a photo she'd found in the Heritage Room, Colonel Marin Voss standing beside a battle-damaged A-10, hand resting on fuselage, expression calm and satisfied and utterly unpretentious. Rodriguez looked at that photo often, reminded herself that competence was quiet and heroism was mostly just showing up, that the work mattered more than the recognition. She tried to pass those lessons to the pilots she eventually mentored with varying degrees of success. Some understood immediately, others needed to learn through experience. A few never got it, stayed focused on prestige and advancement and personal glory. She didn't judge them too harshly. Everyone had to find their own path. The A-10 community continued its work, flying missions that rarely made headlines, supporting ground forces who needed someone to show up when everything went wrong. The aircraft remained ugly and slow and magnificent, built around a gun and armored for survival, designed for the specific mission of bringing people home. New pilots learned to love it or at least respect it, learned that effectiveness mattered more than appearance, learned that sometimes the most important thing was simply being useful. Decades passed. The wars shifted, the enemy changed, the political context evolved. But the fundamental mission remained consistent: show up when needed, execute with precision, bring everyone home. The A-10 kept flying despite periodic attempts to retire it, kept proving its worth through performance rather than promises, kept being exactly what the mission required even when that mission wasn't fashionable or prestigious. Marin Voss's name faded from active memory, became historical footnote known mainly to people who studied close air support doctrine or who trained at the facility bearing her name. The specific details of her life collapsed into simplified legend: brave pilot, heroic rescue, legacy of excellence. The complicated truth of her actual experience, the years of being overlooked, the philosophical foundations borrowed from wheat farming, the uncomfortable reality that one dramatic mission had secured recognition that consistent competence never achieved, those details were lost or simplified beyond recognition. But the essential truth remained, carried forward in culture and training and the accumulated wisdom of professional community. The A-10s kept flying, ugly and slow and magnificent, bringing people home because that's what they were built for. And somewhere in the accumulated tradition of pilots who flew them, in the unspoken understanding of what the mission required, Marin's philosophy persisted: read conditions carefully, make good calls, stay on station until the work is done. The wheat field wisdom of knowing when to harvest, applied to the sky, to combat, to the fundamental human obligation of caring, whether numbers on screens came home to families. That was the legacy that mattered. Not the medal or the ceremony or the building dedication, but the principle encoded in practice, passed down through generations who understood that effectiveness required caring, that competence without care was just technical proficiency, that the difference between adequate and excellent was deciding other people's lives were worth your absolute best effort. It was a legacy written in survival, in ground forces who came home, in missions executed correctly under impossible conditions, in the quiet satisfaction of work done right without need for recognition. It was a legacy that would persist as long as people kept showing up to do difficult jobs with care and precision, as long as someone understood that heroism was mostly just competence applied consistently when consequences were severe, as long as pilots looked at the sky and decided that being useful mattered more than being impressive. The combine still harvested wheat in Nebraska fields, GPS-guided now but performing the same essential function: reading conditions, making good calls, bringing the harvest home. The A-10s still flew their ugly, slow, magnificent missions, bringing different harvests home through different means, but with the same fundamental philosophy. And somewhere in that convergence of agriculture and aviation, of practical wisdom applied to lethal circumstances, Marin Voss's actual legacy persisted, not in headlines or history books, but in the accumulated practice of people who understood that the most important work is rarely the most visible, that effectiveness matters more than recognition, that sometimes the highest achievement is simply showing up and doing the job right when everything is going wrong and nobody else can help. The sky remained. The missions continued. The work went on, executed by new generations who learned the old lessons in new contexts, who discovered for themselves that competence with care was the only philosophy worth practicing, that glory was accidental and usually irrelevant, that bringing people home was its own reward regardless of whether anyone noticed. Reaper 2-1's call sign lived on, invoked in moments of crisis, reminder of what was possible when training and determination and genuine care converged perfectly. Not invincible, not superhuman, just someone who'd read the situation correctly and made the hard call and stayed until the job was done. Anyone could do the same, given sufficient skill and courage and the willingness to decide that other people's lives were worth personal risk. Most people wouldn't. That was what made the difference. That was what made it matter. The harvest continued.